The impossible encounter, Cayce and Clinton, echoes of a prophecy. The story begins not with a literal encounter, but with a collision of ideas, eras, and destinies. Edgar Cayce, born in 1877, died in 1945, long before Bill Clinton emerged as a political figure in the United States. However, the echoes of Cayce's visions, his trance readings, his premonitions about geological changes, economic crises, and spiritual transformations seemed to resonate with uncanny accuracy in the decades that followed. Clinton, for his part, rose to power at a time of global transition. The end of the Cold War, the birth of the Internet, the reconfiguration of economic alliances. The world was changing, and Cayce, decades earlier, had already spoken of a time when leaders would be tested not only by wars, but by internal collapses, crises of national identity, and a spiritual bankruptcy that would threaten to erode the foundations of Western civilization. During his presidency, Clinton faced scandals, diplomatic crises, and a changing economy. But what few people know is that, in esoteric circles, there were those who believed he was a key player in a larger prophecy. Cayce had spoken of a leader from the South, someone who would emerge at a time of great turmoil, and who would have the power to influence not only the United States, but the spiritual destiny of the world. Clinton, born in Arkansas, educated at Georgetown and Oxford, seemed to fit this archetype. He was not just a politician. He was a symbol of an era that sought to reconcile technological progress with human values, globalization with national identity, and power with vulnerability. Cayce's readings on Atlantis, for example, spoke of an advanced civilization that fell because of arrogance, corruption, and spiritual disconnection. Many scholars of prophecy began to draw parallels between Atlantis and the modern United States, especially during the 1990s, when the country seemed economically invincible but deeply divided internally. Clinton, with his charisma and intelligence, tried to maintain balance, but the signs of collapse were everywhere: growing inequality, ignored environmental crises, and an increasingly polarized political culture. In a famous reading, Cayce mentioned that America will be tested as never before, and its leaders will be called upon to awaken not only to material problems, but to spiritual ones. This phrase, though vague, was interpreted by many as a reference to the end of the 20th century, when the United States faced not a conventional war, but a war of values, narratives, and truths. Clinton, with his ability to speak to different audiences, seemed to be the ideal mediator, but also the symbol of the moral ambiguity that Cayce warned about. He was both admired and criticized, elevated as a visionary, and attacked as an opportunist. The connection between Cayce and Clinton is not literal, but symbolic. It is as if the visions of the sleeping prophet had anticipated a type of leadership that would emerge in times of transition, and Clinton, with his mix of pragmatism and idealism, embodied that figure. The 1990s were marked by technological advances, but also by a growing sense that something was wrong, that the world was accelerating toward a breaking point. Cayce had spoken of changes in the poles, of earthquakes in unexpected places, and of a new consciousness that would emerge after the collapse. Many began to see these signs not only in nature, but in politics, culture, and the economy. Clinton, at the end of his term, left an ambiguous legacy. The economy was strong, but scandals had eroded public confidence. Globalization was advancing, but jobs were disappearing. Technology connected the world, but also created new forms of alienation. It was as if the world was experiencing the transition Cayce had predicted, a moment when everything seemed possible, but also dangerously unstable. And Clinton, with his ability to navigate between worlds, between ideologies, between truths, was the leader Cayce had described. Someone who emerged amid the chaos, tried to maintain balance, but inevitably swept away by forces he could not control. Translated with dpel.com, free version. Prophecies in Trance, Cayce, the Economy, and Clinton's Mirror. Edgar Cayce, in his most enigmatic readings, spoke of a future in which the world's economic systems would be shaken by invisible forces, not only by wars or natural disasters, but by a moral and spiritual bankruptcy that would erode the foundations of trust between nations. He described a time when gold would lose its luster and markets would be dominated by illusions. These words, spoken decades before the rise of digital markets, rampant speculation, and financialization of the global economy, seem almost prophetic when viewed in the light of the 1990s, especially under the presidency of Bill Clinton. During his administration, the United States experienced an era of unprecedented economic prosperity. Unemployment fell, the deficit was reduced, and the stock market soared. But behind this facade of success, there were signs of imbalance. The deregulation of the financial sector, which began in previous years and accelerated under Clinton, created a fertile environment for speculative bubbles. The repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, for example, allowed commercial and investment banks to merge, creating financial conglomerates that were too powerful to fail and dangerously interconnected. Cayce, in her readings, had warned about the concentration of power in invisible hands, and many scholars saw this economic policy as a symbolic fulfillment of her words. In addition, Cayce spoke of a crisis of confidence that would spread like a shadow over institutions. Clinton, with his charismatic style and communication skills, seemed to be the perfect antidote to this crisis, but also, paradoxically, its catalyst. The scandal involving Monica Lewinsky and the subsequent impeachment process were not just political events. They were symbolic earthquakes that shook the public's perception of leadership, truth, and integrity. Cayce had said that leaders will be tested not by their external actions, but by their internal consistency. And Clinton, in this sense, became the mirror of society that valued results but struggled with the truth. Globalization, another phenomenon that intensified under Clinton, also appears in Cayce's readings, albeit in a veiled form. He spoke a network that would cover the world, of invisible connections that would unite peoples and nations, but warned that this union would be fragile if not sustained by spiritual values. The rise of the Internet, the expansion of global supply chains, and the economic interdependence between countries created a new world order, but also a new vulnerability. When one link in this chain breaks, the entire system suffers. Cayce had predicted that the fall will come not from war, but from the disconnection between spirit and matter, and the years following the Clinton administration, with crises such as the dot-com bubble and the 2008 financial crisis, seemed to confirm this view. In the geopolitical arena, Cayce spoke of nations that would rise from the east and alliances that would change shape like clouds in the wind. During the Clinton administration, the United States faced complex challenges: the war in the Balkans, the rise of China as an economic power, and the first signs of instability in the Middle East. Cayce had mentioned that the earth will be divided between those who seek power and those who seek wisdom, and Clinton, with his pragmatic foreign policy, tried to balance these two poles. But ethnic conflicts, selective bombings, and diplomatic negotiations showed that the world was far from finding that balance. On a spiritual level, Cayce was even more incisive. He spoke of a new consciousness that would emerge after a period of darkness, and of an America that would need to rediscover its soul. Clinton, although not a spiritual leader, became a symbol of this quest. His speeches often appealed to universal values, to the idea of a global community, to the importance of education and empathy. But scandals, contradictions, and political polarization showed that this American soul was fragmented. Cayce had said that the heart of America will be tested, and its response will determine the fate of the world. And the 1990s were, in this sense, a laboratory of moral and spiritual choices. The connection between Cayce and Clinton, therefore, is not linear but symbolic. It is as if the Clinton administration were the stage where Cayce's prophecies began to manifest, not as supernatural events, but as historical, social, and spiritual patterns. The economy was booming, but its foundations were eroded. Politics became more sophisticated, but truth became relative. Technology connected people, but it also isolated them. And Clinton, with his ability to navigate between these worlds, became the protagonist of a narrative that Cayce had anticipated. The story of a civilization on the brink of collapse, trying to find meaning amid abundance. The earth in convulsion, Cayce, cataclysms, and Clinton's silence. Edgar Cayce, in his most disturbing readings, spoke of a living, pulsating earth in constant transformation. He did not see the planet as a mere stage for human action, but as a conscious organism, reacting to the spiritual and moral vibrations of humanity. In a trance state, Cayce described in surprising detail geological changes that would occur in the not-too-distant future. The shifting of the poles, the emergence of new land in the Atlantic, the sinking of parts of the California coast, and earthquakes in regions previously considered stable. To many, these visions seemed like mystical delusions, but as climatic events intensified, the words of the sleeping prophet gained a new layer of credibility. During Bill Clinton's administration, the world began to feel the first tremors of this new geological era. More intense hurricanes, devastating floods, prolonged droughts, and record temperatures began to become part of everyday life. Climate science was already warning of the effects of global warming, but political decisions were still timid, cautious, and often hostage to economic interests. Clinton, although he promoted advances in environmental policies, such as signing the Kyoto Protocol, faced strong internal resistance. Congress, dominated by corporate interests and climate skeptics, sabotaged more ambitious initiatives. Cayce had said that leaders will have a chance to listen to the earth, but many will choose silence, and that silence echoed in the corridors of power. Cayce's readings on Atlantis are particularly relevant in this context. He claimed that the ancient Atlantean civilization had mastered advanced technologies, but had fallen because of arrogance and spiritual disconnection. According to him, the Atlanteans had manipulated natural forces, including crystals and magnetic fields, and caused imbalances that led to the sinking of their continent. Cayce warned that modern humanity was repeating the same mistakes, exploiting resources without wisdom, ignoring the signs of nature, and building civilizations on unstable foundations. Clinton, as the leader of an expanding superpower, was at the epicenter of this historical repetition. America, with its obsession with growth and consumption, was becoming the new Atlantis, brilliant, powerful, but dangerously vulnerable. During the 1990s, science began to confirm some of the changes Cayce had predicted. The melting of the polar ice caps accelerated, sea levels rose, and previously dormant geological faults began to show activity. Cayce had mentioned that the Earth will respond to human imbalance with movements that cannot be ignored, and earthquakes in places like Kobe, Japan, and the hurricanes that devastated the Caribbean seemed to be part of that response. Clinton, although informed by experts, faced the political dilemma of acting without popular support. The economy was booming, and any more drastic environmental measures were seen as a threat to growth. Cayce had said that the time of choice will be brief, and many will not see the abyss until they are falling, and this collective blindness was beginning to manifest itself. In addition to natural disasters, Cayce spoke of a planetary purification, a process in which the Earth would rid itself of accumulated negative energies. He did not see cataclysms as punishment, but as a natural consequence of spiritual imbalance. Clinton, with his rhetoric of hope and renewal, tried to promote a more conscious vision, but scandals and political divisions undermined his moral authority. America, according to Cayce, should be the light among nations, but it was becoming a symbol of contradiction, a leader in technology, but negligent of nature, a defender of freedom, but a prisoner of consumption. The signs were everywhere, but the dominant narrative insisted on ignoring them. Cayce also mentioned that changes will begin in the heart of America, and many interpreted this as a reference to the geographical and spiritual center of the country. During the Clinton administration, extreme weather events began to hit Midwestern states, agricultural regions vital to the economy. Droughts decimated crops, tornadoes became more frequent, and the sense of instability grew. Clinton, though concerned, was limited by the political and economic structures that surrounded him. Cayce had said that the leader will see, but will not be able to act, and this powerlessness in the face of the magnitude of natural events became increasingly evident. The relationship between Cayce and Clinton in this regard is marked by tension between vision and action. Cayce saw the planet as a reflection of the human soul, and Clinton, although aware of the challenges, was a prisoner of a system that valued immediate results. The Earth was crying out, but ears were preoccupied with partisan disputes, media scandals, and campaign promises. Cayce had warned that the time of the Earth is not the time of men, and the 1990s showed that humanity was late in its response. Clinton, with his intelligence and sensitivity, could have been the catalyst for profound change, but the world was not yet ready to listen. The invisible awakening, Cayce, the American soul, and the spiritual void of an era. While the eyes of the world were focused on political scandals, technological advances, and diplomatic conflicts that marked Bill Clinton's years in office, Something deeper and quieter was beginning to unfold beneath the surface of American culture. It was as if, beneath the surface of prosperity and progress, there was a growing unease, a sense of emptiness, of disconnection, of a search for something that could not be bought, legislated, or broadcast via satellite. Edgar Cayce, decades earlier, had spoken about this phenomenon. He called it the Night of the Soul, a period in which humanity, especially the United States, would face a spiritual crisis so profound that even material advances could not fill it. During the 1990s, this crisis began to manifest itself in subtle but powerful ways. The increase in antidepressant use, the explosion of self-help books, the growth of esoteric movements, and the popularization practices such as meditation, yoga, and spiritual channeling indicated that something was missing. America, which had become the epicenter of innovation and wealth, began to ask itself, where are we going? Cayce had said that the soul of the nation will be called to awaken, and many will hear the call, but few will understand its origin. And that call echoed in bookstores, spiritual study groups, and alternative communities that sprang up in cities like Sedona, Asheville, and Santa Fe. Bill Clinton, although not a spiritual leader, was sensitive to this unrest. His speeches often appealed to universal values, to the idea of a new era of responsibility, to the importance of empathy and community. But the political system in which he was embedded did not allow these ideas to be translated into concrete action. Cayce had warned that leaders will be messengers but not masters, and Clinton seemed to embody this limitation. He could point the way, but he could not compel society to follow it. And society, increasingly fragmented between consumption and consciousness, between progress and purpose, began to seek answers outside traditional institutions. It was in this context that Cayce's prophecies gained new relevance. His writings, previously confined to esoteric circles, began to be rediscovered by a generation that felt that something was wrong, but did not know exactly what. Cayce spoke of reincarnation, spiritual healing, past lives, and a deep connection between body, mind, and spirit. He said that illness is a cry of the soul that has not been heard, and many began to see modern epidemics, depression, anxiety, addiction, not just as medical problems, but as symptoms of a spiritual disconnect. Clinton, with his rhetoric of hope, tried to offer comfort, but the signs of collapse were everywhere. American culture, during this period, began to divide between two poles, that of scientific rationality, which sought logical explanations for everything, and that of alternative spirituality, which sought meaning in the stars, crystals, and subtle energies. Cayce had predicted this division, saying that science and spirituality will walk together, but first they will need to confront each other. And this confrontation began to manifest itself in public debates, on television programs, in books that mix quantum physics with mysticism. Clinton, as a public figure, was often called upon to take a stand, but his response was always diplomatic, avoiding extremes. He knew that America was searching for something greater, but he also knew that any attempt to institutionalize this search would be viewed with suspicion. Behind the scenes, however, there were signs that the spiritual quest was influencing political decisions. Concern for the environment, for example, was not just an ecological issue. It was an expression of reverence for the earth, something Cayce had emphasized in his readings. He said that the earth is sacred, and its pain will be felt by those who still have ears to hear. Clinton, in promoting preservation policies, was, consciously or not, responding to this call. But economic interests, market pressures, and cultural resistance made these actions timid and insufficient in the face of the magnitude of the spiritual challenge. Cayce also spoke of a new generation of seekers, young people who emerge in times of crisis, bringing with them ancient wisdom and a renewed vision of the world. During the 1990s, this generation began to manifest itself. Young people who rejected materialism, who sought alternative communities, who studied astrology, alchemy, and shamanism. Clinton, with his informal style and ability to connect with young people, was seen by many as a symbolic ally of this transformation. But the political structure in which he operated did not allow this alliance to become a revolution. Cayce had said that change will come from within, not from above, and the spiritual movements that were emerging on the margins of society seemed to confirm this prophecy. Invisible Wars, Cayce, The Destiny of Nations, and Clinton's Dilemmas. Edgar Cayce, in his most disturbing readings, spoke of a time when wars would no longer be fought only with weapons and armies, but would take place in the invisible fields of consciousness, information, and energy. He predicted that the battles of the future will be fought in the minds of men, and the victors will not be those with the most power, but those with the most spiritual clarity. This vision, spoken at a time when war was still synonymous with trenches and tanks, seemed absurd. But as the 20th century drew to a close and the United States consolidated its position as the world's greatest military power, Cayce's words began to resonate with unsettling accuracy. During Bill Clinton's administration, the United States faced a series of ethical and strategic dilemmas that tested the limits of diplomacy, military intervention, and global responsibility. The Bosnian War, the genocide in Rwanda, the bombings in Kosovo, the attacks on facilities in Sudan and Afghanistan. All of these events presented Clinton with decisions that could not be resolved by brute force alone. Cayce had said that the leader will be called upon to act, but every action will have a spiritual price. And Clinton, with his strategic intelligence and political sensitivity, seemed to understand that the world had changed. Wars were no longer just territorial. They were moral, symbolic, and deeply spiritual. The intervention in Bosnia, for example, was marked by hesitation and international pressure. Clinton knew that Europe was on the verge of new fragmentation, and that the United States, as a hegemonic power, could not remain silent. But he also knew that any military action could be seen as imperialism in disguise. Cayce had warned that America will be tempted to impose its will, but it must remember that its strength lies in serving, not in dominating. This tension between leadership and imposition permeated all of Clinton's decisions. He sought coalitions, international legitimacy, and tried to avoid the role of global sheriff, but the increasingly unstable world demanded quick and forceful responses. The genocide in Rwanda was perhaps the most painful episode of this dilemma. While hundreds of thousands of people were being massacred, the United States hesitated to intervene. Clinton, years later, would publicly acknowledge that the omission was a mistake. Cayce, in her readings, had spoken of the pain of the innocent that will be ignored by those with the power to act, and this silence in the face of the African tragedy seemed to be the literal fulfillment of that prophecy. America, with all its resources, failed to protect the vulnerable, and Clinton, although personally touched by the tragedy, was hindered by a system that prioritized strategic interests over human values. In Kosovo, the situation was different. The NATO-led military intervention, with strong support from the United States, was seen by many as an example of humanitarian action. But Cayce had warned that even noble acts, if done without spiritual clarity, will bring unexpected consequences. And the consequences came: regional instability, international resentment, and the strengthening of anti-American narratives. Clinton, in trying to protect civilians, also fueled perception that the United States acted selectively based on geopolitical interests. Cayce saw these contradictions as part of a larger process, the testing of the American soul, which would be judged not by its victories, but by its consistency. In addition to armed conflicts, the 1990s saw the emergence of a new form of warfare: information warfare. Cayce, in an enigmatic reading, mentioned that the truth will be distorted and many will fight without knowing what they are fighting against. This phrase, uttered decades before the internet became ubiquitous, seems to anticipate the informational chaos that was beginning to take shape. Clinton, with his communicative skills, was a master at controlling narratives, but also a victim of them. The Lewinsky scandal, for example, was amplified by an increasingly voracious media and showed that the war for public perception was as powerful as any armed conflict. Cayce saw this battle as spiritual, the struggle for truth, integrity, and clarity amid the noise. The rise of international terrorism was also predicted by Cayce, albeit symbolically. He spoke of invisible forces that will attack the centers of power, not for territory, but for message. During the Clinton administration, the first signs of this new threat began to emerge. The attacks on American embassies in Africa, the attack on the USS Cole, and the first warnings about al-Qaeda. Clinton tried to respond with surgical strikes, but he knew he was dealing with something new: a war without borders, without armies, without rules. Cayce had said that the enemy will be fear, not man, and that phrase seemed to capture the essence of the challenge that lay ahead. The silent collapse, Cayce, post-Clinton, and the layered fall. Edgar Cayce never described global collapse as a sudden explosion, a cinematic apocalypse. His visions were more subtle, more unsettling, as if the world were slowly falling apart, layer by layer, while most people continue to live as if nothing were happening. He spoke of an invisible collapse, a sequence of events that, taken individually, would seem like ordinary crises, but which, taken together, would reveal systemic failure, economic, environmental, cultural, and spiritual. And that is exactly what began to unfold in the years following the end of Bill Clinton's administration. The beginning of the 21st century brought with it a sense of continuity. Technology was advancing, markets were globalizing, and the promise of a new era seemed within reach. But Cayce had warned that the glare of progress will hide the shadow of decline. And that shadow began to manifest itself more and more clearly. The dot-com bubble burst, revealing that much of the prosperity of the 1990s was built on unrealistic expectations and rampant speculation. Cayce had said that gold will be replaced by promises, and promises will dissolve like mist in the sun. The economy, which seemed solid, proved fragile, dependent on narratives and volatile confidence. The September 11th, 2001, attacks were the most visible breaking point. Cayce, in obscure readings, spoke of towers that will fall, and the world will see that the enemy is not outside but within. Although he did not mention dates or locations, many saw in this phrase a symbolic anticipation of the collapse of the Twin Towers. The attack was not just an act of terror. It was a deep blow to the American psyche, a wound that exposed previously ignored vulnerabilities. Cayce had said that security will be an illusion, and fear will be the new currency. And that is exactly what happened. The world entered an era of surveillance, paranoia, and preventive wars, while freedom was traded in the name of protection. In the environmental field, the signs of collapse became increasingly evident. Cayce had spoken of changes in the poles, storms that will not respect seasons, and seas that will reclaim land. The post-Clinton years saw an intensification of extreme weather events, more destructive hurricanes, uncontrollable forest fires, prolonged droughts, and floods in previously stable regions. Science confirmed global warming, but Cayce saw beyond the data. He saw an Earth reacting to humanity's spiritual imbalance. He said that nature is a mirror of the collective soul, and when that soul is lost, the mirror breaks. And the mirror was breaking, reflecting a civilization that had lost its sense of reverence for life. Culturally, the collapse was also visible. Cayce spoke of a confusion of voices, where truth will be negotiated and wisdom will be ridiculed. The information age, which promised accessible knowledge, became a battleground of narratives, fake news, polarization, and manipulation. Social media, which emerged as tools for connection, became arenas of conflict, vanity, and alienation. Cayce had said that knowledge without purpose would be poison, and that poison began to spread, eroding trust in institutions, leaders, and even reality itself. Culture, once celebrated as an expression of the soul, became a product, a spectacle, a distraction. Spiritually, the collapse was perhaps the most profound. Cayce had warned that the human soul will be called to awaken, but many will prefer to sleep. And spiritual sleep manifested itself in subtle ways. The trivialization of faith, the commodification of spirituality, the emergence of instant gurus and superficial doctrines. The search for meaning, which had begun in the 1990s, was hijacked by an industry that sold enlightenment in packages. Cayce saw this as a symptom of despair, an attempt to fill the void with ready-made formulas, without real transformation. He said that true change will come through suffering, not convenience. And suffering, though avoided, began to accumulate. The United States, as the epicenter of this process, became the clearest reflection of Cayce's prophecy. The nation that led the world in innovation, consumption, and influence also led in inequality, violence, and fragmentation. Cayce had said that America will be tested as never before, and its response will determine the fate of the world. And the response, until then, was ambiguous. There was resistance, hope, movements of renewal, but also denial, distraction, and fear. The collapse was not only external, it was internal, silent, and deeply spiritual. When Clinton left office, he also left behind a legacy of ambivalence. He had promoted prosperity, but he had also planted the seeds of fragility. He had tried to balance ethics and pragmatism, but the world demanded more than balance. It demanded transformation. Cayce saw leaders as catalysts, not saviors. He said that the leader is the mirror of the nation, and when the mirror breaks, the nation must look at itself. And the United States, after Clinton, was facing that broken mirror, try to understand who they were, where they were going, and what they had lost along the way. The last prophecy, Cayce, redemption, and the final call. Edgar Cayce was never a prophet of doom. He was a messenger of transformation. Although his reading spoke of cataclysms, collapses, and profound crises, he always emphasized that these events were not punishments, but invitations. Invitations to awaken, to change, to rebuild. He said that suffering is a messenger of the soul, and the soul only transforms when it listens with humility. And given the scenario that unfolded after Bill Clinton's administration, with invisible wars, collapses at all levels, and a fragmented culture, the question Cayce left echoing is more urgent than ever. Is there still time? The answer, according to Cayce, does not lie in governments, institutions, or economic systems. It lies in the individual. He believed that each person carries within themselves a spark of change, and that collective transformation begins with a personal choice to live with purpose, integrity, and spiritual connection. He said that a single awakened heart can illuminate an entire city. And this vision, though poetic, is deeply practical, because the collapse he predicted is not only external, it is internal. And reconstruction also begins from within. In the years following the Clinton administration, the world plunged into an era of acceleration. Everything became faster, more connected, more volatile. But Cayce had warned that speed is the enemy of wisdom. And this acceleration brought with it a new form of distraction, a constant escape from oneself, a search for answers outside, while the real questions remained ignored. Cayce saw this as the greatest danger, not physical collapse, but spiritual oblivion. He said that the world will not end with fire or ice, but with indifference. But even in the face of the scenario, Cayce remained hopeful. He spoke of a new light that would emerge after the darkness, of a generation that would not be defined by fear, but by the courage to feel. He said that the children of pain will be the parents of wisdom, and this new generation is already beginning to manifest itself. Young people who reject cynicism, who seek purpose, who connect with the earth, with each other, with mystery. They do not follow gurus. They follow their intuition. They do not seek ready-made answers. They seek true questions. And Cayce saw in them the seed of redemption. America, according to Cayce, still has a role to play. He said that the land of liberty will be called upon to teach love. But to do so, it needs to heal. It needs to look at its wounds, racism, inequality, violence, arrogance, and turn them into bridges. Clinton, with all his contradictions, was a reflection of that struggle. He tried to unite, but he also divided. He tried to inspire, but he also disappointed. And Cayce saw this as part of the process. The leader is not perfect. He is human, and his humanity is the mirror of the nation. The global collapse, then, is not the end. It is the threshold. Cayce said that the fall is the beginning of the rise, and that rise will not be technological, economic, or military. It will be spiritual. It will be silent, intimate, profound. It will be made up of daily choices, listening instead of reacting, feeling instead of judging, serving instead of dominating. Cayce saw the future as a fertile but demanding field. He said that the new earth will be built by clean hands and open hearts. And those hands and hearts are already among us. Cayce's last prophecy, though never spoken in exact words, is implicit in all his readings. The world can change if human beings change. And this change does not depend on revolutions. It depends on revelations. Personal, intimate revelations that transform the gaze, the gesture, the silence. Clinton, at the end of his term, left a divided country, but also one full of potential. And Cayce, decades earlier, had already seen this potential and trusted in it.